Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, and today we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff, really. It's a perspective on the ancient world that maybe isn't always talked about as much as it could be.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of surprising when you first encounter it.
Yeah, totally. So basically, we've got all these sources we've been looking at, and they explore this idea, this really compelling idea that Sumer and Elam, these ancient civilizations, in Mesopotamia and Iran, what's now Iran, right? They actually, they owe a lot more than we might think to migrations of people from like the Kushite areas of Africa, the Nile Valley, that whole region.
Exactly. We're talking about Black African cultures having a much bigger impact on these societies, these like foundational societies, than a lot of the standard narratives give credit for. And the sources we've got, they come from all these different angles: historical analysis, archaeology, even linguistics and stuff from ancient text.
It's like a whole different way of looking at history, right? And that's what we're trying to do with this deep dive. Unpack all these arguments, all this evidence about the Kushite contributions to Sumer and Elam.
Right.
Okay, so before we get too far into it, I think it's important to kind of set the stage, remind ourselves, even though our listeners probably already know this, but just how important Sumer was. Like, Sumer was a huge deal in the ancient world, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Sumer, which flourished around, the 3rd millennium BC, in lower Mesopotamia, the area of the Bible called Shinar, which is modern-day Iraq, basically. It's widely considered to be like the first major high culture in Western Asia.
That's massive when you really think about it.
Totally. I mean, so many things that we associate with later civilizations, they all kind of got their start there.
And when we say high culture, I mean, we're not just talking about, figuring out how to farm or whatever. We're talking about some pretty sophisticated stuff, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Sumerians were incredibly advanced. Like, take their agriculture, for example. They had these complex irrigation systems with canals and reservoirs.
Right.
Or their legal system. And don't even get me started on their medicine. They knew a lot about medicine and their astronomy too. I mean, they were observing the stars and planets in a way that was really ahead of its time.
So they were innovative, basically, like real trailblazer.
Totally. And this is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah, this is where the story kind of takes a turn. Because our sources, they really suggest we need to take a closer look at who these people were, the people who built this amazing civilization. And what they're saying is, there's a really strong case to be made for a Black African influence.
Yeah, and one of the first things our sources point to is how the Sumerians referred to themselves. They actually called themselves the black-headed people.
Wow, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, that's their own self-identification. And our sources say we should take that seriously. Don't just brush it aside.
Black-headed people, that's really something. And then, when you start looking at some of the historical and religious connections they propose, it gets even more interesting.
Right. So, like, the Bible mentions Nimrod, who's a son of Cush. And you have historians like Diodor Siculus and Gerald Massey who connect this Nimrod figure to Osiris from ancient Egypt.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're talking about possible Kushite origins for some of the early leaders in Mesopotamia, like a direct link back to the Nile Valley.
Exactly. It's like a cultural lineage that stretches all the way from Egypt into the heart of Mesopotamia.
That's a pretty bold claim, right?
It is, but our sources don't stop there. They remind us that classical writers, like the Greeks and Romans, folks like Ephorus, Homer, even Strabo, they all talked about the Kushites. They often call them Ethiopians.
Right. I've seen that in some of the older texts.
Yeah, and the point is, they describe these Kushites as living in vast territories, not just in Africa, but in Asia too. So it's not just the Bible, it's all these different sources from antiquity pointing to this widespread Kushite presence.
So the idea is that they weren't just kind of passing through, they were a major force.
Right, and this is where someone like John D. Baldwin comes in. Our sources quote him saying that a Kushite or Ethiopian group was like the main civilizing force in Western Asia.
Wow, that's a huge statement.
Yeah, Baldwin's argument, at least as it's presented in our sources, is that you see their influence everywhere, in the languages, the architecture, the whole way they shaped their civilization. And we're talking about a huge geographical area, the Mediterranean, East Africa, the Nile Valley, even India, and the Indian Ocean Islands.
Wow, that's incredible. And Drusilla Dungy Houston, she adds to this, right? She quotes Diodorus, who described these Kushite Ethiopians as the top dogs, basically, in Babylonian politics, holding high positions in the military and the government.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just that they were there, it's that they were in charge. And then you have George O. Cox, who goes even further and says that Kush essentially established a foothold in Mesopotamia around 2800 BC.
So they laid the groundwork for Babylonian civilization, is what he's saying.
Right. And it's worth pointing out that our sources emphasize that this migration, this influx of Kushites, it wasn't necessarily into a completely empty land.
Right. It was more like they were joining existing black communities that were already there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like groups sometimes called the Grimaldis and Ostrix, they were there way before the Kushites showed up. So the idea is that the Kushites maybe brought with them more advanced cultural practices, leadership skills, that kind of thing, and kind of built on what was already there.
So we've got all these historical and textual interpretations, which are fascinating. But, what about the actual physical evidence? Like, what do the skeletons tell us about the people of early Sumer?
Okay, so this is where things get even more interesting and where there's been a lot of debate. So back in the 1920s, you had these excavations in northern Sumer. The Field Museum and Oxford University were involved, and they unearthed these cranial remains, skulls. And they classify them as Eurafrican.
Eurafrican. That's not a term you hear every day.
No, not really. Basically, they were trying to describe these skulls that seem to have both European and African features. Mm-hmm. But, this was back in the day, and their ideas about race were, well, let's just say they were a product of their time.
Right.
So anyway, this guy T.K. Penniman, he studied these skulls from Kish, and he identified three main groups. He had the Eurafrican type, which he compared to the Combe Capelle skull from Europe, and even to images of Ramses II. Then there was the Mediterranean type, which they were finding all over the place, from Java to, the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. And then there was the Armenoid type.
So basically, they were seeing a mix of different physical types in Sumer.
Exactly. But here's where the controversy comes in. Our sources argue that the very language these researchers were using, terms like Eurafrican and Mediterranean, they reflect a really narrow, and some would say biased way of thinking.
So, they were imposing their own preconceptions on the evidence.
Right. The argument is that if you look at the actual features they were describing, the Eurafrican and Mediterranean types, they're not all that different from what you see in modern African and Black Asian populations.
So the sources are suggesting that Eurafrican might have just been a way to avoid saying black.
That's one interpretation for sure. Now, there were researchers like Buston and Rice who also looked at the skulls from Kish, and they claimed they didn't find any Negroid traits. But the counter-argument is that Eurafrican was basically just a fancy way of saying black without actually saying it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And, when you look at the numbers, Penniman found 8 Eurafrican skulls out of 14, and Buxton and Rice found 17 out of 26. That's a pretty significant percentage.
Yeah, no kidding. So it sounds like the archaeological evidence, even though it was interpreted in a particular way back then, it actually might support this idea of a big black African presence in Sumer.
Right. And it's not just the bones. When you look at the linguistic and cultural connections, things get even more interesting.
Okay, so let's talk about that. I mean, do we see any links between the languages or customs of Sumer and the Nile Valley?
Yeah, there's some really intriguing connections that our sources bring up. For example, they talk about the city of Kish in Sumer and how its name might be connected to Kush in the Nile Valley. It's not just that the names sound similar, it's that they might point to a real connection between the two regions, like a shared origin or something.
Or like an ancestral link.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's this Ethiopian inscription that mentions a place called Quevs, or Kesh, which suggests that the term Kush and all its variations, they might actually have come from that region in Africa.
So we're talking about more than just a coincidence. It's like a possible shared identity.
Exactly. And then you have the writing systems.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
Well, the sources point out that there are similarities between how the Sumerians wrote and how the Egyptians wrote. And they even give an example, like both cultures used a parallelogram symbol to represent the word house.
Wow, that's pretty specific.
Yeah, and then there's this guy Rawlinson, who was a scholar, and he's quoted as saying that the basic vocabulary of the early Babylonians, it had like Kushite or Ethiopian roots, and he draws parallels to modern languages like Mara and Gala.
So we're seeing potential links in the actual spoken language, not just the written language.
Definitely. And then when you start looking at the broader cultural stuff like technology and big achievements, it gets even more compelling.
Okay, like what?
So there's this guy, Richard Lepsius. And he argues that a lot of Egyptian culture actually spread to other places through the Kushites. They were like the middlemen, And he points to specific things like how both cultures used hieroglyphics and how they both made advances in astronomy. And then there's the whole thing about units of measurement.
Units of measurement.
Yeah, like they both use this thing called the Royal Architectural L. And then there's the architecture itself. Both cultures build temples and pyramids, even obelisks.
Obelisks, that's pretty far from Egypt, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point,
Yeah.
These similarities suggest a much deeper connection than just like casual trade or something. It's like they were sharing knowledge and ideas on a really fundamental level.
That's amazing. And what about their religion? Do we see any connections there?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the main god in the Sumerian pantheon, their top god was Anu. And all the other gods and goddesses, they were called the Anunnaki, and they were all considered Anu's children.
Okay.
Now, here's the interesting part. Our sources mention Flinders Petrie and Cheik Anadyop, and they both say that the name Anu was also used for really ancient Egyptian people, like way back in pre-dynastic times.
Wow. So even in their religion, we might be seeing these echoes of a shared past, this connection to Africa.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so now I want to talk about the third dynasty of Ur. What's the significance of that period in relation to all of this?
Okay, so the third dynasty of Ur, that was from about 2112 to 2015 BC. And it was a time when Sumer was united, like really unified, after they kicked out these invaders called the Guti. And Ur became like this big, powerful center. Like the rulers of Ur, they call themselves King of Sumer and Akkad.
Showing that they were in control, basically.
Exactly. And even before that, under this guy Gudea of Lagash, Sumerian influence had spread east into Elam and even to Susa, their capital.
So this was a time when Sumer was really powerful, controlling a lot of territory.
Yeah, a real golden age for Sumer. And this is where the Kushite connection comes back in.
How so?
Well, during this period, Sumer had control over a huge area. Not just Sumer and Akkad, but also Elam, Dilmun, which is modern-day Bahrain, Oman, even parts of the Persian Gulf. And our sources say there's evidence of trade and diplomacy with the Indus Valley civilization.
Wow. So connections all the way to India.
Yeah, and remember, the Indus Valley civilization, that's another culture that might have had Kushite influences. And then there's the architecture. The Sumerians built these huge ziggurats like the Great Ziggurat of Ur, and they look a lot like some of the monumental architecture in Egypt, like Zozer's Step Pyramid.
So connections going both east and west. It's really amazing to think about.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about how powerful Sumer was, but, all empires eventually fall. What happened to Sumer?
Well, a few things. One problem was that they were basically a bunch of independent city-states.
Right. Not exactly a recipe for stability.
No, not really. And then over time, their agriculture started to decline. The soil wasn't as good as it used to be, so they had to rely more and more on food from the north.
So they were getting weaker internally.
Yeah, and then you had these waves of migrations coming from the north, mostly Indo-European and Semitic peoples. The Sumerian texts actually mention these groups, the Martu, and they don't paint a very flattering picture of them.
Sounds like trouble.
It was. And eventually, around 1990 BC, the Elamites and Suchans sacked the city of Ur. That was a major blow to Sumerian power.
The beginning of the end, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. After that, you had more foreign incursions, like the Kassites, who didn't really contribute much to Sumerian culture, but definitely destabilized things further. The Sumerians who were left, they retreated to this marshy area in the southeast, the Sealand. And that was kind of their last stand, their last expression of national identity, before they basically disappeared from history around 1700 BC.
1,000 years of history just gone like that. It's incredible to think about.
It is.
Okay, so now let's turn to Elam, Sumer's neighbor to the east. Our sources suggest that Elam and Sumer share a pretty deep connection, maybe even a shared origin.
That's right. Elam is often seen as the first major high culture in what's now Iran, and they shared a border with Sumer, so their histories are really intertwined. Geographically, Elam was divided into two main parts. You had Anshan in the north, which was mountainous, and then you had Susiana, or Kissia, in the south, which was more lowland. Their capital was Susa.
Got it.
And their history goes way back, to around 3000 BC, the same time as Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus Valley.
So all these civilizations were developing at the same time.
Yeah. And the early Elamites, they called their land Anzan Susanka.
Anzan Susanka.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But anyway, our sources talk about an early ethnic transition in Elam.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, this scholar Diop, he says that Elam was in this kind of in-between zone where people and cultures from the north and south were always mixing.
So it was a melting pot.
Yeah, kind of. And even though the Bible sometimes refers to Elam as a descendant of Shem, which would make them Semitic, the historical evidence suggests that the population of Elam changed over time. They started out mostly black, then became more brown, and then later more white.
So kind of similar to Sumer, where you had this early black presence that got kind of layered over by later migrations.
Right. But in Elam, it seems like the black presence was even stronger and lasted longer, especially in the southern part, Susiana. And you see this in the historical accounts. Rawlinson talks about two different groups living in Elam. The original Elamites, or Elamins, and then these later conquerors called Kishans or Kassians, who were Kushites. And they became the ruling class. Even Strabo mentions this conflict between the mountain Elamites, who are probably less black, and the Susians, who were more Africoid.
So again, we see this connection to the Kushites.
Exactly. And the key takeaway here is that the Sumerians and the Susian Elamites, they were racially very similar. And in both cultures, black people were in positions of power for a long time.
It seems like the more we dig into this, the more connections we find. What about the actual stuff they left behind, the artifacts? Does that support this idea of a connection between Sumer and southern Elam?
It totally does. Elliot Smith, he listed all these similarities between stuff found in pre-dynastic Egypt and early Susa, like arrowheads, stone tools, even the way they made their tools using a technique called pressure flaking. And then there's mace heads, writing, pottery, stone vases, little figures of animals and women, artistic designs, the way they used inlays, metal mirrors, how they spun and wove, even the supports they used for their vases, cylinder seals, architecture, copper chisels. I mean, the list goes on and on.
It's like they were using the same playbook.
Yeah, pretty much. And that suggests a really strong cultural link, maybe even a shared ancestry.
What about the Elamites themselves? How were they described by people back then?
Well, Maspero, he described them as short and strong, with brown skin, black hair, and black eyes. He classified them as nigritic.
Nigritic, so definitely black.
Yeah. And Dulifoy, he thought that ancient Elam was ruled by an Ethiopian dynasty.
Okay, that's pretty direct.
It is. And Rawlinson, he talked about seeing a lot of people in Susiana with Negro type of countenance, with curly hair, large eyes, and full lips.
So again, these consistent descriptions of black physical features.
Exactly. And Harry Johnston, he even said that the Elamites were black, that they passed on their features to the Jews and Assyrians.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And then there's Haddon, who mentions this vase from Susa that has a painting of an Elamite king who's identified as Kushite, and he's painted black.
Okay, so the evidence seems pretty clear on that. What about the role of women in Elamite society? Does that tell us anything?
It does. It's actually really interesting. Women in Elam seem to have had a lot of power, similar to women in ancient Egypt and other cultures with a strong black African influence. Elamite women could sign legal documents, own businesses, inherit property, even sue people and control servants.
That's a lot of rights.
It is. And when you look at the early Elamite documents, they often mention the female relatives of the rulers, which suggests that maybe they had a system of matriarchal succession.
Like the throne would pass through the women.
Right, and maybe even royal incest, like marrying within the family to keep the power in the bloodline. And their main deity, their most important god, was a mother goddess named Kurisha, or Pinakir. So their religion seems to have had this matriarchal element as well.
So the high status of women could be another link between Elam and these other societies with black African roots.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I want to talk about this epic, the Epic of Memnon. Who is Memnon, and how does he fit into all of this?
So Memnon was this legendary warrior king, and he was black. And he was believed to be from Susa. Quintus of Smyrna, he's the one who wrote about Memnon leading all these Ethiopians to help the Trojans in the Trojan War.
Oh, wow. So he was a major player in this big famous war.
Yeah, and a lot of writers from back then, like Homer, Hesiod, Virgil, Diodorus Siculus, they all wrote about him. He was a famous hero, even though he wasn't Greek.
So we're seeing Susa as this powerful place, the home of this famous black hero.
Right. And Diodorus, he says that Memnon led 10,000 Susians and 10,000 Ethiopians plus 200 chariots to help the Trojans.
So a serious army.
Yeah. And then there's Robert Graves, who, in his version of the story, he describes Memnon as this super handsome black guy wearing armor made by the god Hephaestus. And he says Memnon led Ethiopians and Indians to Troy.
So this is like a multicultural alliance.
Yeah, and some people think that Memnon and his army were basically part of this bigger effort by the Kushites to push back against the expansion of other powers, like they were trying to maintain some kind of balance of power in the ancient world.
So it's like this epic struggle playing out on a global scale.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Okay, so we've talked about Sumer's decline. What about Elam? How did they eventually fall?
Well, Elam met its end in the 7th century BC when the Assyrians came knocking.
The Assyrians. They were a pretty tough bunch, right?
Yeah, they were known for being ruthless and having a really strong military.
Yeah.
They had iron weapons, a professional army, siege weapons, the whole 9 yards. And after they were done fighting in Egypt, they turned their attention to Elam. And even though Elam had been a strong kingdom in its own right, they just couldn't stand up to the Assyrian war machine forever.
So it was a war of attrition, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. And finally, in 639 BC, after years of fighting, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, he conquered Susa. And he didn't just conquer it, he destroyed it. He had the ziggurat torn down, took the royal family prisoner, and even salted the earth so nothing would grow there.
Wow, that's brutal. So did that mark the end of the black presence in the region?
Well, it was definitely a huge blow, but it seems like black people didn't completely disappear. Yeah. Herodotus, who wrote a few centuries later, he mentions Ethiopians fighting in the Persian army. And this region called Gadrovia, which was in southern Baluchistan, bordering eastern Iran, it was known as the land of the dark-skinned people. And even when Persian rulers like Cyrus made Susa their winter capital, there were probably still black people living there, just not as many as before.
So they kind of blended into the background?
Yeah, something like that. And even in the early 20th century, this explorer Percy Sykes, he found these communities of really dark-skinned people living in remote areas near Persian Baluchistan. And he thought they might be descendants of an ancient group called the Anariakoi, who are probably Negritos. And Gerald Massey, he even drew a connection between these people, who are also called the Lumlans, and the Bisharis, who live on the border of Egypt and Sudan.
So it's like these echoes of Elam's Kushite past survived for centuries.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's worth mentioning that even today, the ancient region of Susiana is still called Khuzestan, which means land of the Khuz or land of the Kushites.
Wow, that's really powerful.
It is.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I have to say, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, the sources we've looked at, they make a really strong case for a significant Black African contribution to both Sumer and Elam.
No doubt about it.
And the evidence comes from all these different places, how the Sumerians described themselves, what ancient writers said, archaeological findings, linguistic connections, shared cultural traits with Egypt and other places, and these persistent mentions of Black people throughout the history of the region.
And, you know, it's important to remember that history is always being debated and reinterpreted. But the perspective we've been exploring today, it definitely challenges some of the standard narratives and gives us a lot to think about.
It really does. It makes you wonder how much more there is to discover about the ancient world and how interconnected it really was. So to our listeners, I hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on things.
Yeah, I hope so too.
And, you know, as you go about your day, think about this stuff. Think about how it might change the way you view history, the way you view the world. What other questions does this raise for you? What other connections might be out there waiting to be discovered?
That's a good question.
Anyway, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure exploring all this with you.
Likewise. Until next time.